Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. Today I'm going to be covering the digestive system. This is, I believe it should be lecture 5 in the digestive system. This lecture is intended for the students taking my class, Biology 2402 or Human A&P2 at Del Mar College. So this is the 5th in a series of digestive system lectures. And if you're not enrolled in my class, well, I hope you learned something from this. I hope it's helpful. If you are in my class, we're going to start on page, we're really going to review a little bit of page 81, we're going to go on to page 82 and so on throughout the note set. So anyway, as you know, when we started the digestive system, we have to talk about the 4 major organic compounds that we have to digest. That includes carbohydrates, which we digest, they're polysaccharides. They're digested by amylases and saccharidases into monosaccharides, and then we absorb the monosaccharides into our system and use those like glucose, fructose, galactose. We use those for energy, as well as some other things, but primarily for energy. Proteins are the second major class of organic compounds. They're digested by 2 classes of enzymes called proteases and peptidases. They're polypeptides, or long chains of amino acids. So we digest proteins with proteases and peptidases into individual amino acids and then absorb those into the digestive tract. We talked about one major peptidase, and that was pepsin. It's a protease, and it digests proteins in the stomach. Now, the third major class of organic compounds we talked about were lipids. Lipids are fats, oils, and waxes. The primary one that we were discussing was triglycerides. We digest lipids with lipases, enzymes that digest lipids. Primarily, triglycerides are digested into fatty acids and glycerol. We absorb those through the digestive lining into lacteals, the lymphatic system, and then into the bloodstream. And then there was nucleic acids, which are digested by enzymes called nucleases into nucleotides, and then nucleotides are subsequently digested into the 5-carbon sugar, ribose or deoxyribose, phosphate, and a nitrogenous base. Once we absorb all of that, then we can utilize those nutrients to repair, build, grow, all that stuff that happens in our cells. We've already gone through the oral or buccal cavity and what the teeth do. We've gone through the stomach, and we talked about the 3 phases of gastric activity that control the stomach. The cephalic phase, seeing, smelling, tasting, hearing about food, or thinking about food. Everything in the head will start to cause you to salivate, release saliva. We talked about the components in saliva. You need to know those. And it will also cause the stomach to increase gastric activity. Gastric activity involves 2 things. Gastric motility, the peristalsis and the churning contractions, the segmentation from the muscularis externa, as well as all of the secretions of gastric juice. Gastric juice includes water. We talked about its function, mucus, enzymes, particularly pepsin, which is secreted as pepsinogen by the chief cells, and then hydrochloric acid, which is secreted by parietal cells, which converts pepsinogen into the active form pepsin, as well as the other functions, kills microbes, denatures proteins, and helps digest plant cell walls. There's mucus and some other stuff. We talked about the gastric pits and the gastric glands and the cells involved. The apud cells, or G cells, as you know, secrete gastrin. Gastrin is an intestinal hormone, a stomach hormone, I should say, that goes and stimulates the muscularis externa to kick off gastric activity, gastric motility, and it stimulates the chief cells and the parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Remember, chief cells do pepsinogen. Hydrochloric acid is secreted by parietal cells. Now, we're going to move on to the small intestine and go through the small intestine, the large intestine. We're going to go through the liver and the pancreas and their functions. I do want to do just a quick review of what we did last time, because it is it's kind of a complex setup, but I'm going to simplify it for this picture because we went into the details last time. So, as structures pass through the cardiac sphincter into the stomach and then into the small intestine, the duodenum, as they pass through the pyloric sphincter here, there's a number of things going on. That's not the prettiest stomach I've ever drawn, but oh well. Now, a couple of major organs that I need to add to this picture, by the way. I'm going to draw a piece of our liver over here, just a little bit of it. And attached to the underside of the liver is our gallbladder, called the cholecystic organ. It turns out that the liver actually makes bile. As we're recycling red blood cells, our liver is going to convert some of the heme into biliverdin, bilirubin, and then bile. And the bile is being dumped into a couple of tubes here. The right and the left hepatic ducts, they fuse to form a common hepatic duct. And then that is going to come wrap around here, and there's an opening here called a duodenal papilla. The actual opening itself isn't the papilla, but wherever we have a structure that's going to, a tube that's going to secrete into another area, if it's going to be on a surface, we usually have a little bit of a bump that sticks out. It sticks out just a little bit where that tube is going to empty. And so they call that a papilla, like the papillae on your tongue. Papilla really means nipple. So the opening is where we're going to secrete some bile into the small intestine. Now, the pancreas is sitting here, and the pancreas has a long duct called the pancreatic duct that meets up at the exact same opening, the duodenal papilla, and can dump pancreatic juice. Now, if you look at the pancreas, if we could slice it, anytime I think about this, I think about because the pancreas has multiple functions, but I usually think about a bundle of grapes. Every time I go to the grocery store and see a bundle of grapes, I see pancreatic acini. And here's why, okay? If you look at the models, they will always have all these other ducts coming off of here, like this. And if I could follow one of these ducts, they would have many little branching structures here coming off. And at the end of these are these little bundles of cells. And those bundles of cells are called the pancreatic acini. We talked about acinar cells, and plural would be acini, that we talked about when we did the slides of the pancreas. Now, we looked at the islets of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islets. So the pancreatic islets are responsible for secreting several hormones. Two in particular that we worried about were insulin and glucagon. When glucose levels rise very high, the pancreatic islets release insulin, and insulin makes your cells take glucose in. So that lowers your blood sugar levels. Glucagon is secreted when glucose is gone. You know, the phrase I like to use is, when glucose is gone, we secrete glucagon. Glucagon released from the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets, because insulin comes from the beta cells. The alpha cells secrete glucagon when there are low levels of blood sugar. Glucagon can go and target the liver and skeletal muscle and break down glycogenolysis, to release glucose molecules to raise our blood sugar so that we have enough energy until we can get the next meal. And then we restock everything. So we talked about the pancreatic islets when we did the endocrine system. Outside of the islets, though, you had all these little round bundles of cells. And under a microscope slide, if you could look at them in a perfect slice, you have these little groups of cuboidal cells. And imagine a little three-dimensional bundle, almost as if you sliced a grape open. And this tube in the middle, what would be connected here would be a duct. And several of these ducts would have an acinar cells, or pancreatic acini. At the end, they're going to dump their secretions into this tube, and all of these will collectively dump little bits of pancreatic juice into these tubes. These tubes will connect to other tubes and larger tubes, and eventually connect to the pancreatic duct. So I think whenever you grab that major stem, if you grab some grapes, that's like the pancreatic duct. And then off of that are all these smaller branches. And at the end of that are the grapes, the pancreatic acini. So they kind of look like that. And these things are all over the liver. So your liver is both, the pancreas. The pancreas is both an endocrine and an exocrine organ. The endocrine function are the hormones, insulin and glucagon primarily. The exocrine portion is the pancreatic acini, because their secretions are going to be dumped into the outside world. As much as we want to think of the inside of the digestive tract as inside our body, it's not. It's I like to think of us as one big funny shaped donut. There's a tube, there's a hole going through you, just like in a donut, that goes and snakes around for a while, but eventually comes out the other end. So that's really the outside world. So these are exocrine secretions. It is the pancreatic acini that secrete pancreatic juice into the duodenum at the major duodenal papilla. Okay, that is the same opening that the bile ducts from the liver secrete into. Now, before I get much further, let me explain this. We had 4 major classes of organic compounds: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. We saw that we began carbohydrate digestion in the mouth with salivary amylase. Okay, and of course, when we're babies, we have some renin that helps us, and lingual lipase that helps us digest fats from breast milk, because fat is very important for our growth and development when we're young, especially. So we do carbohydrate digestion in the mouth. Makes sense. We need the energy first, and then we do protein digestion. If you ever watch any of these survival shows, one of the current ones on TV that's one of my favorites is Naked and Afraid, because it shows you the human body in the primitive conditions under which our whole systems all evolved to help us survive. And the number one thing that they crave outside of water is protein. They're constantly hungry for protein. Our brain needs tons of protein to make neurotransmitters and receptors and all sorts of things that are constantly being turned over. So we constantly have to replace them. But your body is burning proteins, all your liver albumins and all the fibrinogens and all the clotting factors and all these liver proteins for blood that we've talked about. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So your body absolutely has to have protein in order for you to survive and be normal and healthy. So it makes sense that proteins are the next thing that we digest in the stomach. We want to make sure the sugar and the protein is there. Then we can worry about the fats and the nucleic acids. Okay. Well, we did carbohydrate digestion in the mouth, protein digestion in the stomach. Now we're entering the duodenum. We're getting to the intestinal phase. We did the cephalic phase. When you see food, smell food, hear about food, taste food, think about food, you start salivating. The salivary glands secrete saliva, which are filled with water and mucus and some buffers and salivary amylase. And then when we get to the gastric phase is when food starts entering the stomach. When we combine the digestive contents of the stomach with all the stomach juice, gastric juice, we call that chyme. This is a term that I haven't used, but chyme is one of the terms that is used for to describe the contents of the stomach once it's all mixing together. Now, once we pass the gastric phase, about 2 to 3 hours, this pyloric sphincter holds everything in there, and we churn it up and mix it up and digest it and mechanically process it. Still haven't done any absorption yet anywhere. We're going to start releasing the digestive contents, all that chyme, into the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine, which is right where the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder meet up with it. So what happens is this. The pancreas has 4 major classes of enzymes that it secretes. And you should know what these mean now. So the pancreas secretes a stuff called pancreatic amylase. We know what amylases do. It's the same stuff almost as salivary amylase. It digests carbohydrates. It can secrete saccharinases. So that's all our carb digestion. It does proteases and peptidases. So we're going to digest protein in the duodenum. It secretes lipases, and it does nucleases. So the pancreas is so incredibly vital for digestion because it secretes almost all of the enzymes that digest most of our food. We prep everything and get it ready, and then when it hits the duodenum, we really dump all these enzymes and pancreatic juice in there, and we start digesting everything. If you lose your pancreas, if it stops functioning, you will die. You'll starve to death. As sad as it is to think about, The famous actor Patrick Swayze, big hunk of a man. All the ladies used to fawn over him in the 80s and 90s. I think he was a former male Chippendale dancer. And if you saw pictures of him before he died, he was dying of pancreatic cancer, largely due to a lot of the smoking that he did. He was a heavy, heavy smoker. But nonetheless, if you see pictures of him when he was dying, he looked like he weighed about, I think he weighed somewhere around 90 pounds at his death. He was literally skin and bones because all the food he ate with his pancreas not functioning ran right through him. His body digested everything, and he essentially died of starvation because the pancreatic cancer shut down his ability to digest everything. He had no nutrition. So our pancreas is a major player. As a matter of fact, pancreatic cancer is one of the deadliest cancers that there are. Some people can survive it if it's caught early. But anyway, so all of this is in pancreatic juice. There's some other things in pancreatic juice, by the way. I'm going to list them. The components of pancreatic juice are going to include all of these enzymes. It's going to include water. It's going to include some mucus. It's going to include buffers. The buffer is bicarbonate ion, HCO3-. And those buffers are hugely important. These buffers here are going to neutralize all the stomach acid. The pH in the stomach is 1.5, approximately 1.0 to 3, depending on how much acid is in there. Most of your body, the esophagus and everywhere else in your body, is slightly basic, 7.4 on average. 7.35 to 7.45 is the average pH of most of your body. Your blood, your interstitial fluids. Stomach is extremely acidic. If any of that acid makes it up into the esophagus, it eats holes, causes esophageal ulcers. So we really shouldn't be puking a whole lot and vomiting. That's one of the major side effects to bulimia is when people eat and then vomit, all that acid eats up their esophagus. If that stomach acid eats holes in the stomach, you get what's called a peptic ulcer or gastric ulcer. That is aided and abetted by the bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, and they also help eat holes in there, but they need acid to help them out. And if the acid is dumped all the way down into the duodenum, you get duodenal ulcers if it's not neutralized. So one of the things that happens is when this stomach acid is dumped into the small intestine, these bicarbonate ions will neutralize it. Okay, so the pH of the small intestine goes back to about 7.4 eventually. So we neutralize all that acid. So these are the important players in pancreatic juice. All of the enzymes, amylases and saccharadases, proteases and peptidases, lipases and nucleases, water, mucus, and some buffers. Okay, all of that gets dumped here. Now here's what I'm trying to get to. These enzymes are valuable. They are expensive. If you watch some of these survival shows, you see how difficult it is for them to get protein, to kill an animal and consume it for the protein in its body. So when we do get protein and we can replenish all these enzymes and all the energy that we get from proteins, as well as all the brain neurotransmitters and everything, you don't want to lose this stuff. You do not. So because these are so expensive, we can't, sorry, my son's trying to come in through the back door. These are so expensive, we don't want to lose them if there's no food in the small intestine. We do not. So there is a small muscle at this opening that clamps it shut. That muscle is known as, some books call it the pancreatico-hepatic sphincter. Let me write this out because it's a big snotty word. So I'm going to erase the water and the mucus and the buffers over here. But some books call this the pancreatico, from the pancreas, hepatic sphincter. Other books call it the hepatopancreatic sphincter. And some books even call it the hepatico-pancreatic sphincter. And sometimes it's called the sphincter of Oddi or Odi, depending on how you want to say it, if you eat tomatoes or tomatoes. But All of these are the exact same muscle. It's a sphincter muscle, an annular muscle, at the opening to this pancreatic duct and the common bile duct where they meet up. And that muscle, if there's no food in the small intestine, that muscle clamps this shut so that we're not releasing any pancreatic juice, okay? So you need to know the sphincter of Oddi or Oddi or the pancreatico-hepatic sphincter. Now, because that sphincter is closed, we're not only not releasing all the pancreatic juice and not losing the enzymes, but we're also not releasing the bile. And we're recycling millions of red blood cells every minute and pumping out bile like crazy, and it's coming down this tube. If the tube is clamped shut at the sphincter of Oddi, then the bile starts to back up. I don't want the bile to back up into my liver and into my tissues. That's jaundice. And it occurs for a number of reasons, so, because the fluid is pushing down this way and pushing back up this way, if that tube is closed, that forces the bile through another tube into the gallbladder. So the gallbladder stores the bile. The liver produces bile. The gallbladder stores it, and the gallbladder will also concentrate the bile by absorbing some of the water. Bile has in it a number of compounds. It has a lot of water, it's got a lot of salt, and it has, there'll be some other stuff, but I'm going to get into that in just a little bit. I don't want to get too far down this track. So ultimately, when the pancreatico-hepatic sphincter is closed, we're not secreting any pancreatic juice, we're also not secreting bile, and the bile gets stored in the gallbladder. And by the way, I forget the exact percentages, but something like 85 or so % of the human population has, in addition to this primary pancreatic duct, there's another branch that comes off and runs over here and also dumps stuff through another opening, and that is called the accessory duct of the pancreas. Not everyone has one, and so that one is in addition to the main pancreatic duct that everybody has. And both of them have a sphincter that can control their release. But the right and left hepatic ducts, the common hepatic duct, the cystic duct, and the common bile duct will all fuse together and release bile at the same opening as the pancreatic duct. When it's closed, no pancreas secretions, no liver secretions. By the way, if it gets blocked far enough down by gallstones, so bile has a lot of salts in it, and if we absorb too much water and become dehydrated, those salts will start to crystallize and form little stones and be released through here. And they can be very uncomfortable, supposedly. I've never passed one, but never had one that I know of. But when they get stuck in the ducts, it can cause a buildup of bile into our tissues, which we would call jaundice. And if the gallbladder starts to get too full, because there's some little channels here, and the channels get blocked, fluid can push the stone out of the way and enter the gallbladder, but then the stone falls back and blocks, and so we can add fluid to the gallbladder, but we can't release it. It becomes swollen or inflamed, called cholecystitis, and it can rupture, which can be lethal. It can cause major abdominal infections and things. So when gallstones get caught in here, it can cause cholecystitis. If they get caught further in the tract, they can cause jaundice by causing bile to back up. If they get stuck all the way down here, they can also cause pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is inflammation of the pancreas, and essentially what can happen is some of these enzymes can build up and start digesting the pancreas itself, and it becomes very inflamed, kicks off immune reactions, and is very uncomfortable, and it can really damage the pancreas and lead to some long-term issues. So gallstones are really bad things for a number of reasons. So nonetheless, now I'm trying to secrete bile, I'm trying to secrete pancreatic juice with all these enzymes, but this is closed up. The only thing that relaxes the pancreatico-hepatic sphincter is when chyme from the stomach begins to enter the small intestine, and we're now in the intestinal phase of digestion. And we talked about these hormones last time. I'm going to erase all these enzymes, but we talked about some of this. We know that, I'm going to review some of the hormones, I'm going to put them in red. The stomach itself secretes gastrin. Gastrin goes from the stomach back to the stomach and excites the stomach. It kicks off gastric motility and gastric secretions, gastric juice, stomach juice. And then the pancreas can secrete There's a compound called GIP, gastric inhibitory peptide. And this hormone can slightly inhibit stomach activity, shut it down. It turns out that it really has to be in high concentrations. So there's a stuff called glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide. Insulinotropic means it has a tropic or changing effect on insulin. Turns out that the GIP, which is now called glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, can actually cause the pancreas to release insulin in response to high levels of sugar. So they changed the name. But nonetheless, it can inhibit the stomach some, and it really goes and stimulates the liver to secrete insulin. I'm really not super concerned with GIP, but a lot of people would be. I'm more interested in these hormones called secretin and cholecystokinin. We've spelled out CCK. You need to learn what CCK stands for, cholecystokinin. So secretin from the pancreas itself can actually inhibit gastric activity. It shuts down the stomach. Secretin also can stimulate the pancreatic acini to secrete pancreatic juice. And really, secretin is... If you read 5 different textbooks, you're going to get 4 different answers. But secretin causes a lot of the bicarbonate ion, a lot of buffer to be released into the duodenum. So those particular acini that apparently secrete more bicarbonate ion and buffer are really stimulated by secretin. And then there's cholecystokinin, and these hormones come from the pancreas and go back to the pancreas. Cholecystokinin can stimulate the acini to secrete a lot of the enzymes that I erased here. And so they stimulate the pancreas to secrete a lot of stuff. Now, cholecystokinin, when it was first discovered, actually was shown to go to the liver and gallbladder and stimulate the secretion of bile. It causes some smooth muscle in the gallbladder to start releasing this very concentrated, rich bile, and these 2 hormones can actually relax the pancreatico-hepatic sphincter. So they not only cause these organs, secretin and cholecystokinin, causing the secretion of bicarbonate ion and all the other pancreatic juice, the enzymes, respectively. They can also, particularly cholecystokinin, can stimulate the gallbladder to increase secretion of concentrated bile, and they relax the pancreatico-hepatic sphincter so the liver and gallbladder can secrete the bile and the pancreas can secrete the pancreatic juice. I wanted to reiterate those 3 hormones, okay? So you should know them and you should know what they do. Now, if you're in my note set, if you're one of my students, on page 82, we talk about the 3 sections of the small intestine. So I hope you got all these enzymes down. I want to leave part of this picture up for a reason. But I will have to erase it at some point. Now, the small intestine, as you know, is divided into the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum in order. So as food exits here, it goes through the duodenum, goes through the jejunum, and into the ileum, and then into the large intestine. There's a couple of things I want y'all to know on page 82. That's why I have this table here, and everything's in there for you. The duodenum is roughly 10 to 12 inches. It's about a foot long or so. And some specializations about the duodenum is we have the duodenal papillae, where the openings for the ducts are to secrete into the duodenum. And the duodenum receives a whole lot of acids from the stomach, but it receives the buffers from the pancreas to neutralize that stomach acid. And there's a lot of enzymes going on there. So some of the things that are happening in the duodenum, if I wanted to plug these numbers in, is in the duodenum, we're going to get a whole lot of secretion. Because these are doing some digestion, we're going to get a whole lot of digestion. And then we begin absorption. Near the ends of the duodenum, we have the cells, and in the duodenum itself, we have the cells that can begin absorbing all the nutrients that were broken down from the proteins and lipids and carbohydrates and nucleic acids. So we begin absorption in the duodenum, but we certainly have a whole lot of secretion, and we have a whole lot of digestion occurring there. When we get to the jejunum on average is somewhere around 7 to 9 or 10 feet long. It's about 8 feet long on average. Now, there's some digestion continuing as the digestive contents move through it, But this is where we really begin high levels of nutrient absorption, nutrients and vitamins and other things. Well, not a lot of vitamins, but nutrients for sure. There are tons of villi and plicae and folds and folds and folds. We have plicae with other folds on top of them called villi, with folds on top of that called microvilli. And then as we move into the ileum, we continue all this nutrient absorption. When we get to the end of the ileum, so I'm going to erase all this because I want to show you something. I really do need to get a bigger board. Actually, yesterday I had one that a friend of mine brought over, but it's so gargantuan that it's too heavy to put on the wall. But it would have been perfect if I could find a way to utilize it. But nonetheless, when we get to the end of the ileum, so your ileum is going to snake around and snake around and snake around, and it's a big like bowl of spaghetti. But the end of the ileum comes across here, and it dumps into the large intestine. And there's an opening here called the ileocecal valve, because this structure is called the cecum. When we look in the walls of the ileum has all these structures in the walls that look like little nodules, really not diverticuli, but if I could look within the wall of the ileum with all its folds like this, in one of the layers here, it's a terrible drawing, but nonetheless, we have these little nodules that are in the walls of the ileum. Those little nodules are referred to as Peyer's patches. So one of the unique features at the end of the ileum is these Peyer's patches. These are lymph nodes. So the ileocecal valve is a sphincter muscle that stays clamped shut so that food can stay in the small intestine so that we can absorb it. It takes quite a bit of time, quite a few hours, but that gives us maximum time to absorb as many nutrients, all those amino acids and sugars and fatty acids and glycerol and the components of nucleotides. We need to absorb that. This is why there's so much small intestine, so that we can, take in all this nutrition. When it's ready, the ileocecal valve will relax, and then the digestive contents will fall into the cecum and then move up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, through the sigmoid colon, the S-shaped region, and then into the rectum. Now, one of the things that's unique about the large intestine, the colon itself, is it's very rich in bacteria. As a matter of fact, one of these bacteria I know all of y'all have heard of, called E. coli. The E stands for Escherichia, but nobody can say or spell Escherichia, so everyone says E. coli. There's also a number of other bacteria that live in the large intestine, quite a few. This is the probiotics that you're trying to take in. When you take things that are probiotics, they have all the beneficial bacteria that we need to replace in our colon, especially if you take antibiotics. They not only kill the bad bacteria, they can kill the good bacteria. And there's a term in biology called the flora and fauna. The flora, like flowers, are the plants that live in an area, and the fauna are all the other life that live in an area. If you're studying a big patch in a field biology class, ecology, you look at the flora and fauna that live in a specific area. Well, the normal gut flora, you'll hear this term, and some people now use the term the biome, but the normal gut flora, or the biome of the gut, is all of these beneficial bacteria. E. coli gets its name because it's found in the colon. And as long as they're in the colon, they do a good job for us. What these bacteria do is they literally break down the waste that we can't break down and absorb elsewhere. And their waste that they spit out from eating our waste is a lot of the vitamins that we absorb. So by the time the digestive contents get to the colon, it's very runny liquid. It looks like pea soup, the green, nasty looking stuff, and it smells horrid if you ever get to do an autopsy. And the bacteria in there will start to digest some of that trash and spit out vitamins, and we absorb the vitamins. We also absorb a majority of the water in the large intestine. And as we absorb that water, what that guarantees is when it finally is released through elimination from the anus and the rectum, it doesn't come out as fluid under normal healthy circumstances, but in semi-solid masses and feces. And the reason we compact that feces and all that waste down into semi-solid masses is because we do most of our water absorption in the large intestine. Okay, so the small intestine has a lot of digestion going on because of the pancreatic juice and the 4 major classes of enzymes, plus the bicarbonate ion in the water. And we begin absorption in the duodenum. And then we continue absorption in the jejunum and ileum. We do most of our nutrient absorption, a tremendous amount of nutrient absorption. All the sugars, all the amino acids, all the breakdowns from lipids and nucleic acids are all absorbed before we get to the large intestine, an overwhelming majority. When we get to the large intestine, that's where we do an overwhelming majority of water and vitamin absorption. You need to know that. Where do we absorb most of our nutrients? Duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Where do we absorb the water and the vitamins? A majority of it in the large intestine. And as we pull that water out, what comes out at the end is now a sort of rehydrated, or I should say a dehydrated mass, because we removed most of the water. All right? So I know that's kind of jumping around a little bit, but what I was going over on page 82 is the sections here of the small intestine. You need to know those details. We talked a little bit about insulin, glucagon, and pancreatic juice on this page. I skipped the enzymes at the bottom. I'm going to do those in a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the liver. The liver truly is an amazing organ. I'll come back to it in just a second. And then there's not a whole lot that I wrote about the large intestine other than it's where we absorb most of the water and the vitamins because of the normal gut flora, the healthy bacteria in your gut. Okay. Now, I did talk a little bit about the gallbladder and cholecystokinin and secretin and their effects. I need to talk a little bit about the liver, and we're getting close to finishing up the digestive system. I'm going to end this video, and I'm going to talk about the liver, and then I'm going to talk about, I'm going to reiterate some of the enzymes and go in a little bit more detail there. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope this helped you understand what's going on with the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas and the duodenum, and gave you a little insight into some of the important structures. Oh, I'm sorry. The Peyer's patches, lymph nodes. Okay, our lymphatic vessels are interrupted by these little bundles of tissue that they run through, and they filter lymphatic fluid through these little bundles of tissue through all these little channels. The anatomy of a lymph node is pretty cool. But lymph nodes are filled with monocytes, which are phagocytic white blood cells. They can, any dirt or debris or trash that we absorb goes through the lymphatic system, and those lymph nodes will the monocytes, macrophages that are there, will gobble up any of the trash, but the lymphocytes that are found in lymph nodes will secrete antibodies against any foreign proteins so that it can help prevent any kinds of infections and things. Now, when the ileocecal valve opens, what if some bacteria snuck in the door here? Anytime bacteria are in the small intestine, like if you ingest too much bacteria, if they survive stomach acid and make it into the small intestine, you'll get some food poisoning. If you drink dirty water, Montezuma's revenge, if you know what that is. Montezuma, the king of the Aztecs, who was killed by the Spaniards when they came over and stole all the gold. Well, the Montezuma's revenge is if you go down to Mexico and you drink dirty water, you get diarrhea. And they say, aha, he's got Montezuma's revenge. So anyway, that's because some of the bacteria are in the small intestine. Well, what if some of the normal gut flora made it into the ileum? Well, Mother Nature, in her grand wisdom, put some Peyer's patches all along the end of the ileum so that any bacteria that come in here, we can make antibodies against them and eliminate them and prevent causing our own intestinal infections, so to speak. So anyway, I hope you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did, because I always have a blast talking about this stuff. And I hope that this was helpful. If you're in my class, follow along on the note set. There'll be some worksheets to help you kind of straighten all this out and put the information in a nice, unique form. And our nice, neat form. And if you're not in my class and you just stumbled across these videos, I hope you found it helpful. Sorry for a little bit of rambling. Sorry for the noise and the disruptions in the background. They distracted me for a little bit. But I'm doing this at home, and I'm doing everything in one take. So, I don't want to waste these videos. I hope this was helpful. Hope you had as much fun as I did. I'll see you on the flip side in the next video. Thanks for watching.